welcome to the first episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley Podcast, a production of the Aldous Huxley Centre in Zurich, featuring me, Tobias W. Harris, the Centre's curator and author of the new book Aldous Huxley for Beginners, Robin Hull, and occasionally invited guests. Today we'll be starting from the very beginning. What is the relevance of the writing and thought of Aldous Huxley to readers today? Why should we listen to Aldous Huxley? So welcome, Robin. I want to begin with a very basic question. In just a few words, is it possible for you to tell us about Aldous Huxley? Who was he?
It's a very difficult question to answer because Huxley was such a fascinating and mysterious man in many ways. Some of the obvious things one can say about him are perhaps that he was definitely a member of the intellectual aristocracy of England. He is the scion of a family of great scientists, educationalists, poets, novelists, all the way from Thomas Henry Huxley to Matthew Arnold, that's on Huxley's mother's side, and from Arnold of Rugby to Mrs. Humphrey Ward, and of course Julia Huxley, Aldous Huxley's mother, who started a private school that still exists, Prior's Field, still going strong these days in England. So he's intellectually an aristocrat, though perhaps not financially. He's a polymath. He's one of the most widely read authors in the 20th century, even though he was half blind. Huxley would at this point interrupt me and say, come on, you're missing the main thing. Humans aren't mind bodies. And he would have said of himself that he was an extreme cerebrotonic. In other words, a man who lives in his head. And I would say that he spent a lifetime trying to become more emotional and more physical, trying to become a more loving husband and a more loving father, maybe. He was a political visionary of the first order and one of the leading pacifists, I would think. He was, in fact, also a practicing mystic. In other words, he believed that whatever we say and write is wonderful, but it needs to be backed up by the right kind of being. It's not enough to know. We have to actually also be. In other words are not enough. Awareness is needed. So who was Aldous Huxley? He was a genius, a mystery. I would say one of the most stimulating writers of the 20th century, who very oddly, and that distinguishes him, I think, sets him apart from so many others. Today, he means more than he might have meant during his lifetime, and that was already a great deal.
Wow, that's a really interesting statement. Clearly, Huxley is such a many-sided thinker in some senses. Just for some context, he was born in 1894 and died in 1963. So he was a figure of the first half of the 20th century. I think that last point, that his ideas are more important now, 60 years on from his death, than they were even when he was alive, is very interesting. So in terms of answering this question of why we should listen to what Aldous Huxley has to say, what would Huxley have to say about some of the issues that we are facing now, such as our changing views on personal relationships, our worries about the environment, our concerns about peace and political power, our concerns about technology? Can you just share some ways in which Huxley has some contribution to make to these themes that really concern all of us today?
To take these points in order, personal relationships. From Huxley's point of view, the difficulty with any relationship I might have with another individual, say my wife or my children, in my own case, well, it all hinges on who I am. And in order to reflect on relationships, in order to cultivate a relationship, I need to be more aware of who I am. If I don't know who I am, I don't know who else is with me. I'm not sensitive to others. I have to develop a sensitivity to others. And then the very great difficulty is I'm constantly fluctuating. I change from one state to another all the time, quite accidentally. And I forget when I'm in one state, like talking to you now, for instance, how I might have been at breakfast, ladling cereal into my organism. And God knows what I'll be like in half an hour. So relationships are an elusive and a tricky thing because we don't know who we are. That's one of the key things I think Huxley would say. At the same time, they are absolutely essential because if I spend my life imprisoned in my inner world and don't reach out to others, what will this life be? And fulfillment, maybe, of my life requires me to reach out to others through relationships. So that's just the starting point of a Huxleyan approach to relationships.
Fantastic.
Um,
Fantastic. I want to stick around on that theme, but instead we are going to save that for a future episode and charge onwards to the next point I mentioned, which is touching on questions of the environment and ecology, which I know Huxley had a lot to say on as well.
yes, you see, we're looking at a writer who started reflecting on ecology in the 1920s. He wasn't the first, there's utopian writers in the 1880s and 90s who were aware of the environment. But what we now consider ecology and the ecological approach starts in Huxley big time in his first bestseller, in Point Counterpoint. And then it just blossoms into a much fuller conception of ecology. For instance, the link between the environment and spirituality, the search for spiritual traditions which match the interest in the environment and our relationship to the environment. Beyond Wordsworthianism, shall we say, or 19th century nature mysticism in the Western tradition. And one of the focuses of Huxley through his perennial philosophy is therefore Taoism, because Taoism is to Huxley the exact equivalent in spiritual terms of ecological awareness. Ecology has all sorts of dimensions in Huxley's thought. First of all, politics. Ecology is bound up with decentralism. Second, economics. For ecology to actually be cherished, for the environment to be cherished, we need to produce energy and goods decentrally. Then ecology has to do with psychology. We cannot be mindful of the environment if we're not sufficiently aware, and so on. So just to finish with one thing, in the year of his death, Huxley wrote an essay titled The Politics of Ecology. Now, the definition of ecology made its way into the Oxford English Dictionary. It's still being used. Now, just imagine a man of letters who writes novels, poets, film scripts, and essays, thinks this through so much that the Oxford English Dictionary adopts his definition of ecology and pops it right there in the middle of, other definitions. It wasn't a scientist who made this contribution, it was a man of letters.
That's very interesting. There's certainly something to take away from the fact that Huxley was a polymath and a generalist, and we live in a world in which many people are quite specialized, and so someone who's a scientist won't necessarily have a broad understanding of literature, reading the humanities, and vice versa. And what you're saying is about Huxley and ecology, and beginning, as you said, with comments made in his first bestseller, a 1928 Point Counterpoint, is this idea that spirituality is bound up with our approach to ecology, and in turn is bound up with our approach to politics and the organization of society in Huxley's thought. And I think one thing I'd want to say to develop that idea and try to help people understand why we think it's so important to listen to Huxley now is almost to pose the opposite of that, which is, I believe, the situation that we live in now, wherein, although there are attempts to bring together these different fields of personal psychology, spirituality, technology, there's no shortage of people who are continuing these ideas. Broadly, our approach to solving problems is to have supranational global institutions that are dedicated to solving that problem on a global level, and then to have states involved, to have armies involved, and to have very large infrastructural projects to address these major issues with billions spent on stuff, almost in a way that allow people to go about their daily life doing their job, thinking, well, the World Health Organization is sorting that out, the UN is sorting that out. So what would Huxley's response be to this very centralized and global way in which we try to address problems to do with the environment, health, well-being?
He would argue for as much regional autonomy as possible, maybe something along the lines of federalism in Switzerland. He would argue for grassroots democracy, for autonomous communities that can take decisions and that produce as much as possible locally. In other words, Huxley's notion here resembles that of the American political philosopher Ralph Bourseau. It has its roots in Thomas Jefferson, possibly in, well, Kropotkin. In other words, Huxley referred to himself initially as a Fabian, perhaps in the 20s, later on as a liberal, and from the late 30s onwards, he would have said of himself that he was a philosophic anarchist. Now, not the bomb-throwing variety, not Bakunin, but the peaceful, evolutionary anarchist of the ilk of Kropotkin.
And would you mind, for the benefit of our listeners, explaining what each of those terms mean, i.e. from being a Fabian? What is to be a Fabian? Take us to that place in Huxley's life where he would have been a Fabian socialist.
The Fabian Society is essentially the nucleus of the Labour Party in the UK. They were left-wing, and there was a bunch of them, including eminent thinkers such as Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells. And of course, Huxley joined the Fabian Society at university. But then later on, he started to have doubts. Now, the anarchism bit that I mentioned, the decentralism, is not necessarily a Fabian concept, because socialism was thinking in terms of large states, maybe even a world state that would govern all aspects of life and deprive its citizens of private property, in order to free people. That was the hope from all the disadvantages. Now, a world state does play a part in Huxley's thought. He caricatures the world state in Brave New World, but really he believed that something like a world state was necessary. But it wasn't the Fordian world state in Brave New World that he had in mind, but rather something like UNESCO. which his brother, became the first director general of after the Second World War. In other words, a sort of more voluntary kind of organization internationally that coordinates what? Coordinates applied science, coordinates maybe education, and coordinates medical research, shall we say. In other words, does the few things that a world government would have to meaningfully do in order to improve the lot of mankind, but to delegate as much power as possible to local communities and to do away with the nation in the middle, because Huxley felt one of the greatest threats to our future was nationalism.
Yes, and this is something that makes his thinking so relevant to the period that we find ourselves in now, where there is, of course, a resurgence of all forms of nationalism, whether that is political nationalism, cultural nationalism, economic nationalism, and protectionism. And so this seems to be that Huxley's work evolves through different phases, but a very consistent thread seems to be the opposition to the dangers that are caused by nationalism, because at his generation grows up in the context of World War One, and then from that instills a certain sense of the problems of nationalism that really never goes away, and so that leads him to adopt a pacifist position, which he sustains during World War Two. And I feel like that moment in time, which is sustained in Huxley's thought, is has kind of lost a little bit now, in the sense of we have a nationalism in the sense of just war returning on quite a large scale, and have seen that during the 20th century after World War II. So yeah, maybe it'll be helpful for listeners to understand a bit about how Huxley tried to sustain a position that was against nationalism and against war.
Yes, Huxley, as a young man during the First World War, at first volunteered to join the armed forces. He was obviously rejected because he was half blind. Then he encountered eminent members of the pacifist movement during the First World War at Garsington, at Lady Ottilie Morell's salon. It included her husband and people like Bertrand Russell. Pacifism gained momentum in Huxley in the 20s, and after Hitler came to power, Huxley joined the famous Peace Pledge Union, founded by Dick Sheppard, canon of St. Paul's in London, and he became one of the driving forces of this pacifist movement. It was a point in his life when he also started to appreciate Gandhi more, Mahatma Gandhi, and he started to appreciate that pacifism only made sense if it was seen in the light of human psychology. And that's where a close friend of his started to play a pretty important part, Gerald Hurd. And Gerald Hurd was not just a great polymath in his own right, and in the media in Britain in the mid-30s, and known for his books, he was also a practicing mystic. So at that point, Huxley's pacifism became bound up with mysticism, with the practice of meditation, for instance.
Yes, it's almost like he found, by trying to get to the root of some of these problems, he arrived at a point of personal individual psychology, and so realized that you had to take an approach to social problems which was trying to fix them from the ground up, as opposed to the top down. By changing top down view would be you change overall structures and hope people fall into line, whereas Huxley felt that we had to engage from the bottom up and change the way that individuals reflected on themselves in order to change their interpersonal relationships with others. And that again seems to be quite relevant to thinking today, in which we seem to be increasingly aware of how our own approach to ourselves affects our interactions with others. And there's obviously lots of trends for mindfulness and, different ways of trying to be more attentive to our own thoughts and feelings. And again, I feel like Huxley's influence was very key here.
Well, I think it was because the terrifying insight he had in the mid-30s was that for there to be world peace, we have to change fundamentally in terms of our being. Because as we are in our ordinary everyday state, we are fragmented, will-less. We have at moments highly aggressive and potentially violent, and by moments we're insane. We change from polite and kind and nice to all sorts of horrible things if we are placed in the right kind of conditions, and we helplessly do that. So for there to be a kind of sustainable peace, we have to actually undergo a fundamental psychological change, something that he called varyingly metanoia. That's the Greek term for spiritual transformation, waking up, and so on. So indeed, as you say, one had to start first with oneself to be a pacifist in the real sense of the word, and not just someone talking about peace, someone who was able to actually practice peace in real life, starting now. In other words, we have to start with ourselves, and then we have to find little communities, if we're very lucky, who share the same aim, and then help us to awaken and develop spiritually. By the late 30s, just before England, entered the Second World War, he was saying things like, well, everyone, as many people as possible in England ought to meditate. We don't need aircraft and tanks and ships. What we need to do is to meditate in order to avert the cataclysm of another war. And others, particularly also on the left side of the spectrum, were saying, are you mad? Hitler's about to invade, to conquer the rest of Europe and so on. And you're talking about meditation. Huxley had the same difficulty at this point as Hermann Hesse during the First World War in German literature. And of course, when he went over to the States and continued to be a pacifist of this kind, it neither endeared him to Great Britain nor to the States.
Yes, a very difficult position to adopt, but maybe one with hindsight, when we look at the history that followed the end of World War II, we can see that there's a prescience there, because we certainly haven't managed to. It certainly wasn't just like the First World War wasn't. It was not a war to end wars and bring about peace. It left a legacy of militarization in society. We don't have much time left. We're going to come on to these topics in more detail in subsequent episodes. I wondered if you could close us by telling a reader or a listener who is interested in what we've spoken about, what is a good place to start? What's the first thing they should read? And maybe what the second thing should be? How can someone engage with the thought of Aldous Huxley?
Aldous Huxley was a master of English humor. If you want to read one of his funniest novels, why not try After Many a Summer? If you're interested in spirituality, maybe a good way into that could be The Perennial Philosophy by Huxley. But if the ideas of spirituality mean less to you, maybe than a literary rendering, why not try Time Must Have a Stop? If you want to know more about Huxley's political thought, I'd advise you to read Ends and Means Those are the essays that came out in in the late 1930s that are together. They're like Huxley's political manifesto. I could go on forever.
You've given some great options though. It's almost like a choose your own adventure. You've got a choose your own adventure approach here. Whereas if you are interested in having a good laugh, you can start off with After Many a Summer. If your focus is on spirituality, you should start with The Perennial Philosophy. If, on the other hand, you are looking at more of a literary and philosophical approach, you can take a look at Time Must Have a Stop. Or if you want to dive straight into political thought, which I expect many people will, given the over dominance of global politics, right, as a context for everyday life now, then Ends and Means is the way to go. But you also have your own book on Huxley as well, Robin. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Because it wouldn't be a podcast if we didn't plug something. So we better plug that.
My thinking was that people aged 18 to 25 these days are quite different to young people when I was a teenager in the 70s or a young adult in the early 80s. How are they different? There is more interest in spirituality. I think about a third of the young, at least the more educated, try out some form of meditation. Then I think this generation is no longer quite so keen on literature that just means itself. They're keen on literature that means more than itself, that tells us about the world, about how we are psychologically, about the environment, God knows. So, and finally, I would say that we're looking at a generation that doesn't like to be bored. So I try to write a biography of Huxley and give an overview of his works precisely for young readers. And I try to do it through humor. I think you will find in my book the best anecdotes that have ever been told about Huxley, together with tons of artwork and so forth, and caricatures that were commissioned by artists. And it will, in fact, show that Huxley is a writer who means far more than literature normally means, addresses the problems that the young generation now face, and even suggests solutions that are probably worth reflecting on.
Fantastic. We're going to learn more about that in upcoming episodes, but I think this was a fantastic introduction. So I just want to say thanks very much, Robin, for the time today, and to our listeners, stay tuned for future episodes.
Thank you so much.